So, if you happen to be a Christian out there and at the same time an African or an African descent, have you ever noticed the similarities between the Old Testament culture of the narrative of the Bible and the African culture? They share so much similarities. And don't forget, the Bible was written. African culture preserved through oral tradition. That means it is very common in the ancient African culture for traditions to be passed from one generation to another generation by words of mouth. So one generation teaches the next generation. That tradition, unbelievably, has been preserved because it's a tradition for an African to teach, train, and nurture the next generation about their culture by words of mouth. So this has helped to preserve most of African culture, especially with the fact that Africa itself has gone through enslavement, through colonization, which mostly wiped out most African cultures. The African culture is so rich, and this culture is what keeps the African people going, regardless of wherever they find themselves on the surface of this earth. Be it the African American, be it Africans that live in Jamaica, be it Africans that live in Brazil, be it Africans that live in Asia, there's always that similarity when you find Africans in any part of the globe. Beyond our complexion, the culture is what defines us. So, going back to the Old Testament of the Bible, without much talk on the New Testament, when you pay close attention and interest in the narrative of the Old Testament, you find that there's a lot of similarities between the ancient and the current African culture. 1, circumcision. 2, polygamy. You find that in the Bible, and it still persists in the current African culture. 3, enslavement. 4, the clothing. The clothing in the area of the vibrancy behind the African clothes. Wherever you find Africans, be it in any part of the world, there's something unique about the African attire, the African clothing. When I look at the story of Moses, where he said Moses was wrapped in a certain type of clothing, and it was with that cloth that those who found him knew of his identity. The cloth identified who he belonged to. And when you look at the African continent today and you look at the attire, the cloth, our clothing identify who we are. So the clothing is part of our identity. 5, ancestorship. Ancestorship in the area of genealogy. When the ancestors are remembered and recalled in names like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and so on, up until Jesus Christ. The Old Testament acknowledges the ancestors as it relates to telling the narratives of Jesus Christ. So ancestorship is part of the Old Testament culture, as well the African culture. Then 6, in the Old Testament narrative, it states there the place of the prophet, the place of the prophetesses, and the place of the priest, which is also common to the African culture. The ancient African culture, the place of the priest is to be a mediator between the people and their ancestors or the creator. Same method applies to that of the narrative of the Old Testament. Then 7, the ancient African way of governing and ruling themselves was not by what we have today, as we have countries and states. In the ancient times, pre-colonization, Africans governed themselves by kingdoms and empires. They had empires and they had kingdoms. And when you look at the narrative of the Old Testament too, you find that they existed as, go read your Bible, you'll find out. All this is stated there. So my point here is, whose story is the Old Testament story? Whose experience is the Old Testament? Does this way of life narrated in the Old Testament belong to the African way of life? Because that same way of life of circumcision, polygamy, ancestorship, and so on, like I have stated, all this still plays out in the African culture today. And why have they been preserved? Because a lot has happened to the African tradition. A lot of it has been swept away, but fortunately preserved by the oral way of passing information from one generation to another generation, which still keeps it going on today. Although some of these practices are not being upheld because of the influence of other types of religions over the entire continent and people. So this Old Testament does narrate parts, not completely, parts of the African way of life or culture, which makes me to wonder, is there something deep in this Old Testament record? Is there something of value that the Africans can lay hold of to help them with their identity? Because like I've stated in the 7 points, all this sheer familiarity of the African people, probably this might help to understand our history, understand ourselves as a people, and understand our culture better, because it is the culture that defines the people. All these 7 points defines the African identity. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Do take care. Catch you in the next video. Bye. Bye.